Welcome to Lok Sabha Television. You're watching Climate Matters. I'm Suman Sahai. Our guest today is Raman Mehta, a great veteran of several climate change negotiations and somebody who's followed this very consistently, so has great insights. Raman, welcome to Climate Matters. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks.
Tell us, to start with, Cancun is on everybody's mind. Would you say that Cancun was a failure? Was it a success? Because the general mood about the comments on Cancun have been frustrated, have been more negative than positive. Tell me your first reaction.
Well, it's complicated to kind of give you a very brief, simple top-line answer, but to try and make it simple as well as brief, I would say that, if you were looking at Cancun for a global deal to save the planet and the people, then we didn't get that. What we got, on the other hand, was certain outcomes, which if, or certain decisions, let's say, which if pursued to their logical conclusion, could lead to good outcomes. So, for example, we have now a new climate fund that is to be established.
But tell me, before we get into that, would you say that Cancun has improved at all on Copenhagen, or has it followed the same trend? Because, as I said, the comments are that Copenhagen let the world down and Cancun just continued in that same trend of letting down the expectations of people. And as you quite rightly said, that if this is a deal that's going to save the planet, it's not.
Well, okay, let me put it this way, that if the expectation was, and which it wasn't, to be honest, before Cancun, that Cancun will sort of completely put to bed the ghost of Copenhagen, then that hasn't happened.
No.
What has happened, on the other hand, is that some of the promises that were there in the Copenhagen Accord, relating to finance, relating to technology, relating to forestry, relating to adaptation, those promises have been somewhat redeemed in the form of certain decisions which require further action during this year as well as coming years, in order to realize those promises. However, again, the big failure, I would say, of the Copenhagen Accord again was the low ambition on mitigation targets, as well as a shared vision between developed and developing countries for saving the planet. And that low level of ambition on emission reduction is something that still continues.
But would you say that the shift that has taken place has been that whereas earlier we were talking about differentiated response, the developing countries would have to cut less and the developed countries would have to cut back their emissions far, far more. Would you say that that has been flattened out and that developing countries like China and India are now required to cut emissions much more than has been the case so far? Would you say that that is the case, or are we still looking at a differentiated response?
See, the problem with the classical notion of a differentiation between developed and developing countries is a notion or a classification that dates back to 1992. Since 1992, the political landscape has changed so much, and the dimensions of the problem of the climate crisis have undergone such a great transformation that
How?
Primarily because of inaction, both on the part of developed countries as well as developing countries. So what's happened is that because of inaction in the past and the time that we have lost globally as a global community, the urgency of action is now much greater, and therefore the developing countries also need to participate in a global effort. This particular premise was actually recognized in the Bali Action Plan itself in 2007, which was touted a great success, where the framework was that developing countries will also take action, but will be supported by finance and technology from the developed countries.
Which means that they would be given money to implement certain mechanisms to reduce emissions, that they would get technology for cutting back emissions.
As well as support for adaptation measures, not just mitigation.
Adaptation meaning that how do you adapt to the impact rather than do you just reduce the impact?
Yeah, let's put it, I mean, if we were to put it simplistically, it would be that, you know, one was to quote unquote mitigate the emissions that arise from, you know, anthropogenic or human activities. And the other is to mitigate the impacts that result from these emissions and the emissions that have taken place in the past 150, 200 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution began.
So, are we today looking at, because you see a lot of editorial comment on this, that the developed countries have gotten away with a much better deal in that they don't have to reduce as much as was expected at the Kyoto Protocol level. And today they have to cut back even less than they were required to do. So they are in a better position. And we have to cut back more than we were required to do, putting it very simply. Is that an accurate reflection of what happened after Copenhagen and Cancun?
Again, it's one can't give a simplistic answer. I wouldn't say that, you know, the requirement for developed country actions is less than what they had pledged or what they had committed to under the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, developed country actions or the need for developed country actions to reduce emissions is much greater now than it was in the first commitment period.
So?
Well, that's the accepted wisdom and the scientific opinion, so to speak. Having said that, what is also recognized is that there is more to be done by the developing countries, both in terms of the support that is required to do emission reduction or mitigation actions, as well as from their own sources. So there is this recognition that developing countries need to do more.
Need to, especially China and India are in the...
Well, because of their size, the sheer size of their emissions.
So India is expected now to cut back emissions much more than was expected at the start of these negotiations, say 2-3 years ago. Is that so?
Well, I mean, if you were to say, start of negotiations technically would be the 1990s, early 90s. And certainly, between then and now, India's emissions have grown, and India and China are both the fastest, growing emitters. Having said that, everybody recognizes, every reasonable government and every reasonable civil society person recognizes that both India and China have large deficits still to be overcome.
How do you mean deficits?
Deficits of development. Deficits of whatever comes with those deficits, and so nobody can argue that India and China on their own need to, for example, save the planet. Nobody can argue that. No reasonable person can argue that. Nobody can also argue that the developed countries retain their emission levels at the point at which they are. Everybody recognizes that the developed countries need to cut down their emissions much more drastically than they have done so far in the past. What also is recognized is that the developing country emissions cannot grow at the same trajectory that the developed country emissions had grown, because we simply don't have that sort of carbon space. What is, and this is something that has come from the Indian side now of late, is that we need to, for example, work out a carbon budget where we are saying that, look, our global goal for saving the planet and the people is that temperatures not be allowed to rise more than 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Now, what that implies is a certain carbon budget, which means that the global carbon emissions cannot go beyond a certain threshold. Within that threshold, you need to come or arrive at an acceptable formula of apportioning, that particular budget, right?
Yeah.
Now, India has, for example, suggested that this should be per capita historical accumulation of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's not something that is accepted by all. However, it's a starting point, because nobody can argue that per capita basis is not a
is a wrong place to start.
Is a wrong place to start. But there are other issues that need to be considered and other factors that need to be taken into account. So ultimately, you need acceptable formulation.
So you think India has taken a lead in trying to move this carbon budgeting forward?
Certainly, I mean, India has started a debate on this whole issue of a carbon budget as well as a basis for apportioning.
Was that something that India put on the table?
It's something that India has been putting forth. It's not been, let's say, it's not been formally placed within the negotiations, but it's something on which the Indians have started discussions, both within the developing countries as well as in forums like the MEF and the G8 and so on and so forth.
What is the MEF?
The Major Emitters Forum, or the Major Economies Forum as it is now.
And the G8 are the most powerful
economies. G8/G20 framework.
Right. So you would say that India has taken an initiative in trying to move some sort of, trying to get an agreement in place that will help both developed and developing countries to come back to the negotiating table in realistic terms. Because so far I think we have been more content to be followers rather than leaders in the climate change debate. Would you say that there has been a shift in the leadership role that India is taking?
Well, there has certainly been a shift in the approach that India has taken in the negotiations. The earlier approach of India was that this wasn't a problem that was created by us, which is true, and therefore we need not
do all of that.
We need not do anything
to
mitigate this. But I think there is a realization, at least within the political establishment,
that
that's not an argument that is going to hold water for much longer.
Raman, we'll take a break and then we'll come back to India's position. I also want to come back on the question of technology and finance that has been made available. It's time for a short break on climate matters, but please stay with us because we have an interesting discussion, and I will also tell you what to await in this program ahead. We'll see you in a little while, and we'll continue our discussion with Raman Mehta. Welcome back to Climate Matters. We are talking to Raman Mehta, a seasoned expert, one who has been watching and following the climate change negotiations, and we broke off at what India is doing. Raman, you are happy that India is taking a much more positive role in shaping the discussions and trying to come to some sort of a more positive outcome of the climate change negotiations. I know it doesn't depend only on India, but you say that you are watching this with pleasure, that there is a change that looks good for us. But I wanted to come back to something that you flagged earlier, and that was that the outcome of Cancun was both positive in terms of the fund, the finance support, and positive in terms of technology. The technology barrier has been intellectual property, has there been any movement? Because there was a reluctance on the part of developed countries to give technologies without the IPR licensing. Has there been any movement on that? Are the terms more favorable now?
No, see, actually, on IPR there was no breakthrough, unfortunately. Where there was a breakthrough was that a framework was established for future technology cooperation between developed and developing countries. In that regard, there was a certain institutional framework or architecture that was set up. So there has been an agreement on setting up a technology executive committee under the authority of the Conference of Parties, which would look at needs of developing countries, look at what are the areas in which technologies need to flow and where the barriers are, and give recommendations to overcoming those barriers. At the same time, there is a climate technology center and network that has been created, which is going to be this hands-on implementing kind of a body, which will, for example, do inventory of what kind of research is going on relating
and what
to climate
technologies
change
are available.
and what technologies are available.
So do a need matching.
Yeah, and at the moment, you see, the two areas on which decisions could not be taken because it was very contentious, and developed and developing countries could not overcome their differences. One was on the treatment of IPR. The other was this whole relationship between these different bodies. So, what is the role that the Technology Executive Committee has to play vis-a-vis the Conference of Parties as well as vis-a-vis the Climate Technology Center? Does it give directions to the Climate Technology Center, right? Or is
and
it
then the
empowered to
IPR
do
thing,
that?
just for our readers, I mean, the problem has been that because many of these technologies are patented, they're expensive, and each of these technologies will have to be negotiated independently by developing countries, and that is what developing countries have been saying, that that's not fair. Since you are the polluter, you must give us these technologies on favorable terms. This is just for our readers to follow this debate. Sorry for this interruption.
Also, you see, the point here also is that there is now a growing realization that one of the problems is that technology at the moment, because of the way the governments have kind of withdrawn from their proactive role in technology development, technology now rests in the hands of the private sector.
Yes.
And the private sector will work only on the profit motive.
Absolutely.
And you need to. So there is now a realization that you need collaborative arrangements for future technology development, which is between government on both the developed and developing countries side, where you can have industry participation and private sector participation also, but then that doesn't become the driving force.
Right.
And so there is, and India had given this suggestion that there be these technology centers, and part of that suggestion has been taken on board through the creation of this Climate Technology Center and Network, is where you have collaborative development of technologies and research on
those
on
technologies
future
are more accessible.
And those technologies would willy-nilly, because of the structures under which they are created or evolved, would be more accessible.
Right. So that you would say has been a positive development. The IPR issue remains an issue.
IPR issue remains an issue. Also, you see, there are technical problems there. One of the issues is that if, for example, the Conference of Parties takes a decision on IPR, does that decision have legal force in terms of it has to be
laws,
then
yes, of
it has
course.
to go be taken on under board the WTO, it has to be probably renegotiated. What are the arrangements?
No, I would imagine that the way that you would mediate would be for somebody to pay the licensing, for developed country governments to create a fund, which brings us back to the fund
which
issue.
is where you get the finance
right.
In the
that
picture.
you enable the licensing. These technologies will remain patented, but how do you enable access is by paying for the licensing. But tell me about the fund. Would such a fund have provisions for something like this? What are the main provisions that such a fund is seen to be having?
Okay, in terms of the decision on the fund itself, what was decided was there were two things that were decided. One was that this fund will have equal representation of developed and developing countries, but at the stage of the design of the fund, a transition committee would be set up. And the transition committee would have 40 members, 25 of which would be from developing countries, right? So there, in terms of the design inputs, the developing countries, if they so wish, have a greater say and a greater role. And this is an opportunity for developing countries to ensure that architecture of the fund is created with which they can live.
Yes.
You know.
What about the money into the fund?
Yeah. So that, I mean, like I said, the Cancun deal was a bit of sweet and sour. Yeah, and depending on which side you look at it, it could be either more sour or more sweet. So the sweet part was the fund, and also the fact that there is what was created was a standing committee of finance, which would have a high, oversight and a coordinating role in order to ensure, money flows to the right places, money flows for the right kind of purposes, and so on and so forth. But the sour part of the deal was that the decisions that are required to generate long-term finance were parked. I mean, those decisions could not be taken or addressed.
Okay.
And these matters will hopefully be taken up through this year, reaching up to Durban, where there would be greater clarity of how do you put money into this fund that is supposed to be created.
Did you get the sense that money will be coming into the fund?
You see, that's a difficult question.
Because all the architecture here and there, if there's no money in the fund, then...
See, to be fair, there are certain developed countries that are willing to contribute, even from their own budgetary resources. However, there are certain other countries which I don't wish to name, but would be obvious to many people that, they do not wish to meet their responsibilities. Right? And
the story of the climate change negotiations.
Right. So the issue is that that's where the problem or the logjam is.
Right. I think what I'm reading from what you have been saying is that you don't think that Cancun has been a disaster. There are sweet elements, there are sour elements, and a lot of how developing countries play their cards now will determine whether there is more sweet or there is more sour. Do I read you right? Would you say that that is roughly the sentiment you're trying to express?
I agree.
Yeah, would you say that? That was Raman Mehta talking to us about what happened after Copenhagen and what happened particularly after Cancun. It's good to know that there is a slightly more positive interpretation that Raman brings today than some of the dismal analysis that we have been saying about how it was a complete disaster. And yes, of course, developing countries will have to take the initiative and assume leadership, and India particularly, in shaping the destiny of the climate negotiations as we look forward to South Africa in a year. That is the program with Raman. I quickly wanted to run through with you what you are to expect in this program on climate matters. We will have a number of experts who will talk to us about a range of things. We will start with Dr. Shailesh Nayak, Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences, who will tell us about climate change happening, how they read that, how do they predict the weather. All of us get frustrated when we hear about the weather prediction not being as good as we would like it to be. But Dr. Nayak will explain to us how weather predictions are done, what are the problems, and how they are coping with the climate change issue. We will talk to experts about how traffic is contributing to climate change. What should we be doing about it? What are the solutions? We will also talk to experts about energy. We have Nitin Desai and Prabir Purkayastha from the Delhi Science Forum talking about what our energy constraints are, how should we be dealing with an energy policy that enables us to develop but also keeps our emissions down. We will have Dr. Swaminathan discussing the whole impact, the big picture, the impact of climate change on human security, all of the aspects of human security. We will have experts talking to us about the impact of climate change on agriculture, and included in agriculture, which we sometimes overlook, is livestock. For Indian farmers, keeping a cow or a buffalo or animals is as important as cultivating a crop. So what will be the impact of climate change on our livestock? We have Dr. Garg from the National Dairy Development Board in the program later on telling us how to deal with climate change, how to protect our livestock. We also have the water issue. How is India coping, or what are the plans to cope with the fact that the glaciers are receding, the fact that water is going to become an issue, the fact that monsoons have become and will continue to be variable, uncertain. What is our water policy? What are we trying to do to cope with that? What else do we have? Let me see now. We have the discussion with Beena Agarwal on how will climate change impact women particularly, because women are vulnerable in many contexts. How will they be affected preferentially by climate change issues? And what should the government be doing to protect the whole gender aspect of climate change impacts? What should the government be doing to protect women? We will have a discussion with Dr. Kasturi Rangan to see what is high science thinking about trying to control climate change. What are the experiments that are being thought of, and some of them have even been tried, to try and stop the impact of global warming? What can science do? What is science doing? What are our cities and our urban settlements, the huge kind of migration we are anticipating, the great urbanization that we are anticipating? How does this play out with climate change? How much does it contribute? What should we be doing in order to mitigate the impact of climate change on our urban populations? We will have experts discussing that. We will also have impacts on health. We will have people from the WHO, the World Health Organization, telling us about how climate change is going to change the disease profile. Where malaria was not, malaria might be, and other such things. So this is a program that is going to discuss many aspects of climate change. And I think it's going to be a very educative program because we have experts, the top of the line experts in their various fields, who will talk to us and tell us what the dangers are and what we can do to try and protect ourselves against that. So this is the program on climate matters, which is going to be aired on Lok Sabha television. I would encourage you and your friends and family to watch this program, because it is not only very educative, but it is also very contemporary. Climate change is something that is going to impact all our lives in all kinds of ways. And we will not be able to control this beast unless we all participate. So how do we do that? We can only do that once we educate ourselves. So I invite you to Climate Matters. Watch the show. We have set up an email ID, climatematter@gmail.com. It will come onto the screen, climatematter@gmail.com. And I would also encourage you and invite you most warmly to send us your comments, not only about the program, but also about climate issues that you have confronted or information that you want. In all kinds of ways, I would like this program to be as interactive as possible. So here is launching Climate Matters and welcoming all of you to watch the program. Thank you. I'm Suman Sahai.